Welcome to yet another haunting episode of True Crime Sketches, where we venture deep into the shadowy recesses of human nature. Today's tale takes us to the quiet streets of Metairie, Louisiana, a seemingly peaceful suburb until a chilling affair turned the tranquility into terror. A young life was cut brutally short, leaving behind a community stunned, hearts shattered, and questions burning. This is the story of Brandon Tibido, an 18-year-old whose world unraveled in a web of deceit, desire, and deadly consequences. Brandon Tibido wasn't your average teenager. At just 18, his future was wide open, filled with dreams as expansive as the southern skies. Residing in Metairie, this quiet neighborhood nestled just outside New Orleans, Brandon seemed destined for success. A senior at East Jefferson High School, he excelled both in the classroom and in the auto shop. His love for cars wasn't just a hobby, it was a calling. He spent endless hours tinkering with engines, getting his hands dirty, dreaming of the day he'd open his own repair shop. Friends would often find him in his driveway, grease-stained and grinning, deep in the work he adored. But life wasn't just about cars. Brandon had a heart full of responsibility, a depth far beyond his years. He lived with his grandmother, Mabel, who had lost her sight and relied on him for daily care. Balancing school, a part-time job at a local garage, and the demands of caregiving, he handled it all with a maturity that impressed the entire neighborhood. Everyone admired his kindness. He was the kind of young man who would lend a hand to anyone without ever asking for anything in return. In the realm of love, Brandon appeared to have it all. He had been dating Poet Gerard, a smart, driven young woman who shared his ambitions for a bright future. For 2 years, they'd been inseparable. They spoke of marriage, of building a family, of life after high school. Brandon, ever the gentleman, saved what little money he earned to take Lee out to nice places, where they'd dream over meals about the life they'd build together. From the outside, everything seemed perfect, but beneath the surface, darkness simmered. There was a secret Brandon carried, a dangerous, twisted affair that threatened to unravel his life. He wasn't just involved with Lee. He was entangled with her mother, Poet Gerard, a 43-year-old beauty with a sharp mind and a thriving multi-level marketing business called Beauty Buys. Poet was not just Lee's mother, she was also her rival, always competing for attention, always pushing boundaries. Brandon's secret relationship with Poet gnawed at him. What had begun as an illicit affair now suffocated him, pulling him deeper into a storm he couldn't escape. And that storm was about to break in a violent, horrific way. The morning of August 12, 2021 began like any other sweltering summer day in Metairie. But by 8 a.m., something was terribly wrong. Mabel, blind and ever reliant on Brandon's help, sensed an eerie stillness. She hadn't heard him moving about the house. She called out, her voice echoing unanswered through the quiet rooms. Fear gripped her. Despite her blindness, she managed to dial a neighbor, Mrs. Alice Dupree, a retired nurse living just 2 doors down. Mrs. Dupree, always quick to lend a hand, hurried over. She had known Brandon since he was a boy, always kind, always dependable. But as she stepped inside, she was met with an unsettling stillness. The air was thick, carrying an odd metallic scent. She called for Brandon, but only silence greeted her. Following the disturbing smell, her steps led her to Brandon's bedroom door. When she pushed it open, she was met with a sight beyond comprehension. Brandon lay lifeless on the floor, drenched in blood. His body was contorted, marred by countless stab wounds. His eyes, almost gouged out, told the story of a ferocious struggle. A blood-soaked kitchen knife lay discarded beside him, as if mocking the horror of what had been done. Mrs. Dupree stood frozen, horror-stricken. In mere minutes, police and paramedics flooded West Midi Avenue, their flashing lights painting the quiet street in chaotic colors. The neighborhood, once so serene, now stood as the epicenter of a brutal, incomprehensible crime. Neighbors huddled in shock, whispers of disbelief filling the air. Inside, seasoned first responders struggled to comprehend the sheer savagery of the scene. Detective Michael Duville, a grizzled veteran with over 2 decades of experience, took lead on the case. By his side was Detective Renee Martinez, sharp and observant, known for her keen instincts. As they stepped inside the bedroom, even their seasoned nerves couldn't fully prepare them for the brutality before them. Blood spattered the walls in wild, chaotic patterns. The oppressive August heat only intensified the stench of iron that clung to everything. Brandon's body, crumpled and lifeless, told the detectives all they needed to know. This was no random act. The violence was too personal, too frenzied. It was, without a doubt, a crime of passion. Martinez, focused and methodical, began snapping photos of the gruesome scene, documenting every bloodstain, every angle of the chaos. Nothing could be missed. the knife, abandoned but damning, the smeared blood patterns on the floor and any latent fingerprints, everything was carefully collected, to be analyzed later by forensics. Each detail would help reconstruct the final, horrific moments of Brandon Tibido's life. Meanwhile, the detectives noticed the rest of the house remained undisturbed. The living room, where Mabel sat unaware of the nightmare just down the hall, was untouched, eerily calm. This sharp contrast painted a grim picture. Brandon had been caught off guard, the violence swift, likely in the early hours of his morning routine. Outside, neighbors gathered, hushed whispers weaving through the air as they tried to comprehend the tragedy that had shattered their peaceful community. Detective Duville, sensing the urgency of the moment, wasted no time. He sent officers to canvass the neighborhood. Anyone might have heard or seen something out of place. In a close-knit suburb like Metairie, where everybody knew each other, there was always a chance that a small observation could crack the case wide open. Of course, the first name on Detective Duville's suspect list was Poet Gerard, Lee's mother, and the woman at the center of this tangled web. Poet, 43 years old, was well known in the area, both for her striking looks and her successful multi-level marketing business, Beauty Buys, which peddled cosmetics and skincare products. But beneath her polished exterior, whispers ran through the town. Some suspected her company was a scam. Poet didn't care. She basked in the attention and wealth, reveling in the image she'd created. But her relationship with her daughter Lee was far from perfect. While outwardly close, there was a tension that friends had noticed for years. Poet had an unnerving habit of competing with Lee, particularly when it came to men. This rivalry took a sinister turn when she began an affair with none other than Brandon, her daughter's boyfriend. This secret, guarded closely between Poet and Brandon, gnawed at the core of everything. Poet had convinced herself the affair was a way to reclaim her lost youth, but it was clear to those around her, obsession had taken root. It was a ticking time bomb, and when it exploded, the consequences were deadly. When detectives brought Poet in for questioning, she walked in, visibly shaken but trying to maintain her composed, polished persona. Dressed impeccably in a tailored pantsuit, her makeup flawless, she exuded control, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a flicker of fear, something raw lurking beneath the surface. Duville and Martinez began with the basics, asking about her relationship with Brandon and her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Poet kept her answers cool, claiming she'd been home, working late on her business. Her voice was steady, but there was an undeniable edge to her tone, especially when Brandon's name was mentioned. She tried to downplay their relationship, dismissing him as merely her daughter's boyfriend. But as the interrogation wore on, the cracks in her composure began to show. When Duville pressed her about the affair, her carefully maintained facade shattered. Poet's defenses crumbled, and in a flood of tears, she admitted to the relationship. "He was my angel boy," she sobbed. "Lure is my witness. I would never hurt him." The room filled with the weight of her confession, but Duville remained unconvinced. Her obsession with Brandon, her rivalry with Lee, it all pointed toward something far darker. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, that her tears hid a deeper truth. But Poet wasn't the only suspect. The second, of course, was Lee Gerard herself, Brandon's 18-year-old girlfriend, the other side of this tragic triangle. Lee was a bright, driven young woman, fresh out of high school and eager to start her future. She had been accepted to the University of New Orleans, where she planned to study business management. By all accounts, she and Brandon had been deeply in love. They had even talked about marriage, the kind of dream that lit up their families' hearts in a town where marrying young was almost tradition. However, Lee's world had shattered when she discovered her mother's affair with Brandon. The betrayal was too deep, too raw, leaving her heartbroken and filled with rage. But when the detectives brought her in for questioning, Lee, dressed simply in jeans and a t-shirt emblazoned with her high school's senior class logo, looked far younger than her age, almost childlike in her grief. Her face was pale, eyes hollow, as if the weight of everything had drained the life from her. The detectives approached Lee with caution, asking her to recount her relationship with Brandon and how she had learned of the affair. Her voice wavered, filled with pain as she explained how, just days before Brandon's murder, she had stumbled across explicit texts between him and her mother. The discovery had sparked a vicious argument with Poet, yet despite the betrayal, Lee claimed she still loved Brandon, that she was trying to move past it. "I didn't want to lose him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But when asked about her whereabouts on the night of the murder, Lee's story began to fray. She insisted she had been at a sleepover at her friend Taylor's house, just a short distance from Brandon's home. But when pressed for details, her responses grew shaky. Taylor, questioned separately, confirmed Lee had been there, but mentioned she had left around midnight, just hours before Brandon was killed. As the interrogation deepened, Lee's sorrow shifted into something sharper. Her tears dried, replaced by a rising defensiveness. "I would never hurt him," she repeated, her hands trembling in her lap, her voice hardening. But for Duville, something still didn't sit right. The anger in her voice, the tremor in her hands. There was more simmering beneath the surface, a storm waiting to break. When Lee was shown the explicit text between her mother, Poet, and Brandon, her composure shattered. She sobbed uncontrollably, her grief raw and unfiltered. But for the detectives, it raised a critical question. Was her anguish purely out of heartbreak, or was there something more, something deeper she was hiding? Lee vehemently maintained her innocence, even as she admitted to the profound sense of betrayal she felt. "I was angry," she said, voice breaking, "but I could never—" Her words trailed off, as the detectives exchanged skeptical glances. Her alibi was unclear, her emotions intense. Detective Duville wasn't convinced. Doubts lingered. The investigation was far from simple, and as the pieces began to fall into place, a third suspect emerged. Richard Gerard, Poet's husband and Lee's father. At 47, Richard was a successful, sharp-tongued lawyer, known around Metairie as an ambulance chaser due to his fondness for personal injury cases. He was the type who thrived in a courtroom but was often absent at home, buried in his demanding work. Richard prided himself on projecting the image of a perfect family, despite the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't blind to the growing tension between Poet and Lee, nor to Poet's increasingly inappropriate behavior with other men. But rather than confront it, he chose to look the other way, hoping things would eventually smooth over. That was his strategy. Ignore the problems, maintain the image. When the police summoned Richard for questioning, he appeared impeccably dressed, crisp white shirt and tie, as if walking into court rather than an interrogation room. He maintained his lawyerly composure as Duville and Martinez began their line of inquiry. He described his marriage to Poet as complicated but insisted their bond was still strong. "We were intimate," he noted, his voice flat, as though rehearsed. He spoke of his relationship with Lee with similar detachment, explaining that long work hours had created some distance between them. When the detective shifted the conversation to Brandon, Richard initially seemed at ease. He admitted to liking the boy, even considering him a suitable match for Lee. But as soon as the affair was mentioned, Richard's calm facade cracked. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted to the floor. He avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable. He claimed he hadn't known about the affair until after Brandon's death, but his defensiveness didn't go unnoticed. The detectives pressed Richard about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. He stated that he had been working late at the office, reviewing case files for an upcoming trial. He provided the names of colleagues who could corroborate his alibi, but his tone remained tense. Calm but distant, his answers felt rehearsed, and Duville couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was holding something back. Whether out of guilt or to protect the family image, his detachment raised alarms. As the questioning wore on, Richard's refusal to discuss the affair in depth and his clear discomfort with the topic left the detectives uneasy. Could he truly have been ignorant of what was going on under his own roof? Or was he hiding something darker, something that could explain why Brandon's life had been so violently ended? Richard's aloofness, his focus on protecting appearances, only deepened their suspicions. Then came the tip that changed everything. It was mid-afternoon on a scorching August day when Duville's phone rang. The anonymous caller on the other end claimed to have vital information about Poet Gerard, information that could blow the case wide open. There was something more sinister than an affair, the tipster hinted, something Poet had been hiding for years. The detectives wasted no time. They drove directly to Poet's office, a modest, nondescript building on the outskirts of Metairie. The sign above the door read "Beauty Buys," her multi-level marketing company. On the outside, it looked like any small business. But inside, what the detectives would find would unravel a shocking web of secrets. As they entered the office, the air inside was unsettlingly quiet. Shelves were lined with beauty products, lotions, creams, makeup, but the space felt empty, devoid of employees. Detective Martinez's attention was drawn to a locked door at the back. After some persuasion, Poet's nervous assistant, a young woman barely out of her 20s, reluctantly handed over the key. Behind that door was a private office, Poet's inner sanctum, and what the detectives found inside was nothing short of disturbing. The walls were plastered with photographs, many of them explicit. Nude images of Brandon, taken in secret, lined the room. In one corner, there was a makeshift shrine, candles, trinkets, handwritten love notes, all dedicated to him. Poet's obsession with Brandon had gone far beyond a mere affair. It was dark, twisted, and consuming. But the horror didn't stop there. As the detectives continued to search the office, they uncovered documents that revealed the true nature of beauty buys. What appeared to be a legitimate business was, in fact, a predatory scam. Poet had been exploiting vulnerable women, mostly single mothers struggling to make ends meet, convincing them to invest thousands of dollars in beauty products they couldn't sell. These women, trapped in a cycle of debt, were working 20-hour days just to survive. The discovery of this financial scheme added another layer of motive to the case. Poet's carefully constructed world was crumbling, both professionally and personally. The pressure of maintaining her image, combined with her obsessive love for Brandon, may well have driven her to murder. The detectives left the office with a clearer picture of who Poet Gerard truly was, and the lengths she might have gone to in order to keep her secrets from being exposed. Now, with a deeper understanding of the twisted dynamics within the Gerard family, the detectives had to piece together the final question: who, in this storm of jealousy, obsession, and betrayal, had taken Brandon Tibido's life? With the evidence mounting, the police had finally pieced together the chilling truth about Poet Gerard. The once charismatic businesswoman had descended into a spiral of obsession, lies, and ultimately murder. A woman who, behind her polished exterior, harbored dark and dangerous secrets. The detectives knew they were close to bringing justice for Brandon Tibido, but they also understood that uncovering the full extent of Poet's crimes would be no easy feat. Hey, True Crime Sketches solvers, if you're fascinated by this real-life case, make sure to like and subscribe for more gripping stories. Got any thoughts on this investigation? Or maybe you've got a case of your own you'd like us to dig into? Drop a comment below and stay safe out there. On the morning of August 21st, 2021, the police in Metairie, Louisiana, were finally prepared to act. After painstakingly gathering evidence, including the disturbing revelations from Poet's Beauty Buy's office, they knew exactly who was responsible for the brutal murder of Brandon Tibido. Poet, now 43, had allowed her obsession with her daughter's boyfriend to fester until it reached a deadly climax. Poet Gerard had long been regarded as a dynamic and successful entrepreneur, running her multi-level marketing, MLM company, Beauty Buys, with an air of confidence. But beneath the surface, her life was crumbling under the weight of her illicit affair with Brandon. It had all begun months earlier. What started as an affair quickly turned into an all-consuming obsession. When Brandon, realizing the toxicity of the situation, tried to break things off to focus on his relationship with Poet's daughter, Lee, Poet's obsession spiraled into something far darker. On the night of the murder, Poet couldn't let go. She confronted Brandon at his grandmother's house, a place they had shared secret moments in the past. Fueled by jealousy, rage, and the terror of losing control over him, Poet snapped. Grabbing a kitchen knife, she unleashed a vicious attack on Brandon, stabbing him repeatedly. The brutality of the murder, deep wounds, nearly gouged out eyes, revealed not just a crime of passion, but one born out of an overwhelming obsession. After the murder, Poet had desperately tried to cover her tracks, but her lies and secrets unraveled. Her fraudulent business dealings, hidden behind the glossy MLM facade, began to surface, and her obsession with Brandon became impossible to hide. It all led the police straight to her doorstep. In the early morning hours of August 21st, as the sun peeked over the horizon, the police arrived at Poet's pristine suburban home. The house stood quiet, the neighborhood still slumbering, unaware of the storm about to break. When the detectives knocked, Poet answered, dressed in her silk pajamas, clearly not expecting visitors. The moment they informed her of her arrest for the murder of Brandon Tibido, her face shifted, a blend of shock and defiance. She tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes betrayed her. Beneath the surface, panic was brewing. As Poet was handcuffed and led out of her home, the neighbors began to gather, watching in stunned silence. Many had admired Poet for her business acumen and her charm, unaware of the sinister reality behind the glamour. The arrest sent shockwaves through the quiet streets, and by the time the police car pulled away, the community was already buzzing with rumors and gossip. Back at the station, Poet was booked and placed in a holding cell. She was brought in for questioning, but despite the overwhelming evidence against her, she maintained her innocence. "I didn't do it," she insisted, though her voice now lacked the confidence she had once exuded. The detectives knew better. The evidence was clear. Her affair with Brandon, her obsessive behavior, and the incriminating findings in her office all pointed to Poet as the killer. For Brandon's family, the news of Poet's arrest brought a bittersweet sense of relief. They had been living in fear and uncertainty ever since his murder, haunted by the senseless loss. While their grief remained, the thought of justice being served offered them a small measure of peace. The trial of Poet Gerard for the murder of Brandon Tibido began on November 8, 2021, at the Jefferson Parish Courthouse in Metairie, Louisiana. The case, fueled by scandal, betrayal, and violence, had already drawn significant media attention. Reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and locals alike were eager to follow every twist and turn in what was shaping up to be one of the most sensational trials the small town had ever seen. Poet, now stripped of her once glamorous facade, entered the courtroom a far cry from the woman who had commanded attention in her business dealings. The evidence against her was damning, and with each passing day of the trial, it became increasingly clear that this would be no ordinary courtroom drama. As the trial progressed, the details of Poet's descent into obsession were laid bare. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of a woman who had lost control of her life, consumed by a dangerous infatuation that ended in murder. The defense, however, argued that Poet had been emotionally unstable, claiming she had acted in a moment of temporary insanity. But with the forensic evidence, the chilling photographs, and the disturbing shrine found in her office, the jury's view of Poet grew darker. It became clear that her obsession with Brandon, combined with her desire to protect her fraudulent business empire, had driven her to commit the unthinkable. As the trial neared its conclusion, one question remained on everyone's mind. Would justice be served for Brandon Tibido, the young man whose life had been cut tragically short by a twisted love affair? The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as local news outlets like the Times-Picayune covered every detail of the trial that had captivated Metairie, Louisiana. Spectators packed into the room, eager to witness the dramatic conclusion of a case that had shaken their quiet community to its core. Leading the prosecution was Assistant District Attorney Mark Tremble, a seasoned lawyer with a relentless reputation. At 52, Tremble had built his career on methodical precision, and this case was no exception. From the very beginning, he laid out a damning narrative of Poet Gerard, portraying her as a woman consumed by jealousy and obsession. He argued that her affair with Brandon Tibido had spiraled into a deadly rage when Brandon tried to end their secret relationship. Tremble's case rested on hard evidence, physical proof from the crime scene, testimonies from detectives, and the disturbing discovery of Poet's obsessive shrine to Brandon. He also brought beauty buys under scrutiny, revealing it as a fraudulent scheme that preyed on vulnerable women. The prosecution painted Poet as a manipulative and dangerous figure whose personal and professional life were built on lies. On the defense stood Charles Chuck Lemoy, a sharp and seasoned attorney who had a history of defending high-profile clients. Calm and composed, Lemoy's strategy was to sow doubt in the jury's minds. He argued that the evidence against Poet was circumstantial, suggesting that someone else, possibly even her daughter Lee, could have committed the crime. Lemoy also worked hard to humanize Poet, portraying her as a loving mother and a successful businesswoman who had been unfairly vilified by both the media and the prosecution. As the trial stretched on, the emotional toll on Brandon's family became heartbreakingly clear. His grandmother, who had raised him, attended every session, clutching a worn photograph of Brandon. Lee Gerard, the victim's girlfriend and the daughter of the accused, sat next to her father, visibly shaken by the unfolding revelations. The tension in the courtroom grew palpable, especially during the detective's testimony, which graphically detailed the brutality of Brandon's injuries and the evidence that connected Poet to the murder. On November 22, 2021, after 2 weeks of intense testimony and just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. As the courtroom fell silent, the foreman read the words that would echo through Metairie for years to come: guilty. Paula Gerard was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Tears of relief flowed from Brandon's family while Poet remained rigid, her face drained of color. The word guilty seemed to hang in the air, sinking deeper into her, but she stayed stone-faced, betraying only a flicker of fear in her eyes. The punishment was handed down on December 1, 2021. Poet Gerard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a harsh but fitting end for a woman whose actions had shocked and devastated an entire community. For Brandon's family, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but no verdict could fully heal the pain of losing a young man with so much potential. The trial, however, did more than expose a murder. It also cast a harsh light on beauty buys, leading to further investigations into Poet's fraudulent business practices. The once thriving company was revealed to be a predatory scam that had left countless women in financial ruin. By the time the trial was over, beauty buys had been shut down, leaving behind a trail of wrecked lives and unfulfilled promises. As the sentencing marked the end of one chapter, it left many in the community reflecting on the tragedy that had unfolded. Life in Metairie began to return to normal, but the shockwaves of Brandon Tibido's murder lingered. The once tight-knit neighborhood, where everyone knew each other's business, now carried the weight of a dark and painful memory. The Gerard household, once a symbol of suburban success, grew quiet in the aftermath. Poet's life sentence left a void that was impossible to fill. Her husband, Richard Gerard, a successful lawyer himself, struggled to maintain any sense of normalcy. The scandal had tarnished his reputation, and though he continued his work, he withdrew from social circles, avoiding the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed him everywhere. For Lee Gerard, the emotional toll was even greater. Her mother's affair with Brandon and the brutal murder had shattered her world beyond repair. Not long after the trial ended, Lee left Metairie, enrolling in a college out of state in a desperate attempt to escape the painful memories. Friends said she had become more reserved, no longer the bright, ambitious girl she had once been. The weight of the past followed her, and even though she tried to move on, the trauma was never far from her mind. The aftermath of the trial also reverberated through the broader community. The collapse of beauty buys left many women devastated. Single mothers, wives, and daughters who had invested their time and money into what they believed was a legitimate opportunity, only to be left in financial ruin. Local news outlets such as WLTV continued to cover the fallout, transforming the scandal into a cautionary tale about the dangers of predatory businesses. In the end, the trial of Poet Gerard left a lasting mark on everyone it touched. It was a tragic reminder of how quickly lives can be torn apart, and how the consequences of one person's obsession can ripple through an entire community, leaving scars that may never fully heal.